Leo lived in a house of stone and silence on the edge of the forgotten woods. The village people spoke of him in low tones, a man carved from the same granite as his home. He was a blacksmith by trade, his days measured by the ring of hammer on steel and his nights by the stubborn lock on his gate. For 10 years, since a grief so deep it had scoured his heart empty, he had turned away every woman who came near. The matchmakers with their hopeful smiles, the village girls with baskets of bread, the travelers seeking directions, all met with the same unyielding stare and a closed door. His heart, the villagers whispered, was like his furnace, cold until he chose to light it, and he never did. His world was purposefully small. The forge, the garden, the woods for hunting. He wanted no complications, no echoes of a past that still haunted his dreams. He built walls not just of stone but of routine and solitude, and within them, he found a painful sort of peace. One evening, a storm gathered over the woods. It was not a gentle rain but a violent tempest that tore at the trees and turned the path to his home into a river of mud. The wind howled like a wounded beast. Leo secured his workshop, checked the latch on his gate twice, and retreated to his hearth. The fire inside was the only light against the drowning dark outside. He told himself the storm would pass, like all things, and tomorrow would be the same as yesterday. Then, a sound cut through the roar of wind and rain. It was not the crash of a branch. It was a thud against his heavy oak gate, followed by a scrape. Leo went still, his hand freezing on the cup of tea he was warming. An animal, perhaps. A deer confused by the storm. But the thud came again, weaker, a desperate kind of knock. A deep instinct, one he had buried for a decade, told him to ignore it. To let the storm claim whatever was out there. His own rules were clear. No visitors. No interruptions. Yet, his feet carried him to the window beside the door. He wiped the fogged glass with his sleeve and peered into the chaotic night. A figure was slumped against his gate. It was a woman. Her pale dress was plastered to her skin, dark not just with rain but with long, terrifying streaks of something else. Mud, he tried to convince himself. But even in the poor light, he knew it was not mud. Her head was bowed, and one hand was pressed tight against her side. Leo's breath caught. Every fiber of his being screamed to turn back, to return to his fire and his silence. This was trouble. This was the very complication he had sworn to avoid. He took a step back from the window. As if sensing his retreat, the woman lifted her head. Her face was ghostly white, etched with pain and exhaustion. Her eyes, wide and dark, found his through the glass. They held no demand, no plea, just a profound and utter weariness. Her lips moved. He could not hear the words, but he saw them shape a silent message. A crack of lightning illuminated the scene for a single, frozen second. He saw the vivid red on her side, the tear in her dress, the utter vulnerability of her pose. The image burned into his vision. The thunder that followed seemed to shake the very stones of his house. He stood paralyzed, a war raging within him. His old, cold resolve against a pull he could not name. The woman's head dropped again, her strength clearly gone. Then, she moved once more. With a visible effort that seemed to cost her everything, she raised a trembling hand and pushed against the gate. It was not a knock, but a final, feeble attempt. Her mouth moved again, and this time, as the wind lulled for a heartbeat, her whisper slithered through the gap in the gate and under his door, reaching him as clearly as if she stood beside him. "I need help." 3 words. Simple. Fragile. They did not shatter his walls. They found a crack he did not know existed and seeped through, cold and urgent. The part of him that had been numb for 10 years jolted awake. He found his hand on the iron bolt before his mind could protest. With a grunt that was part resistance, part surrender, he slid it back. The heavy gate groaned as he pulled it open against the wind. She fell inward, not collapsing to the ground, but stumbling directly into the space he had just vacated. She was in his home. The scent of rain, wet earth, and the sharp metallic tang of blood filled his entryway. Leo caught her by her shoulders to steady her. She was freezing cold and trembling violently. Up close, the wound was worse. A deep, ugly gash along her ribs, still seeping. Her eyes rolled back for a second, then focused on his face. "They are coming," she breathed, the words barely audible. "Please." "Who?" Leo asked, his own voice rough from disuse. "Who is coming?" But her eyes fluttered shut, and her weight went fully limp in his hands. She had fainted. The storm raged on, but now it was inside his house, contained in the form of this bleeding, unconscious stranger. Leo was faced with a choice. He could still drag her out, leave her in his shed, and claim he never saw her. Or he could do the unthinkable. He looked at her pale face, the dark lashes against her cheek, the painful clutch of her hand even in unconsciousness. He thought of the whisper that had bypassed all his defenses. "I need help." With a curse that was also a surrender, he bent and lifted her carefully. She was lighter than he expected. He carried her past the hearth, away from the main room, into a small side room that had once been a sewing room, now used for storage. He cleared a cot by shoving boxes aside and laid her down. The rules were broken. The silence was shattered. And as he rushed to fetch hot water, clean cloth, and the small box of medicinal supplies he kept for forge burns, a single thought echoed in his mind, chilling him more than the storm. She said, "They are coming." The hook of her plea had set deep. Now, he was caught in the line, and whatever was chasing her was drawing near. His long, quiet war with the world was over. A new one, fought in the shadows of a stormy night, had just begun. Leo worked with the grim focus of a man trying to outrun his own thoughts. In the dim light of the storage room, he cleaned the wound. It was clean-edged but deep, running diagonally across her ribs. Not an animal attack, he knew that much. This was made by a blade. He stitched it as neatly as he would repair a torn saddle, his big, calloused hands surprisingly steady. She stirred only once, a sharp gasp escaping her lips, her eyes flying open to stare at the ceiling in blind panic before fluttering closed again. He murmured low, meaningless sounds, the way one might to a spooked horse, until she fell back into that troubled sleep. He covered her with a thick woolen blanket, then retreated to the main room, leaving the door ajar. The storm was finally dying, leaving behind a dripping, uneasy quiet. He built up the fire, not for warmth, but for light. He felt exposed, the windows like dark eyes staring in. He kept his hunting knife and a heavy hammer from the forge within easy reach. Every creak of the old house, every sigh of the wind, made his muscles tense. "Who is she?" Asterisk the question pulsed in time with his heartbeat. Asterisk, and who are they? He tried to remember her face. Not beautiful in a classic way, but striking. Sharp cheekbones, a strong jaw now slack with exhaustion, dark eyebrows. Her hands, even in repose, looked capable, but her fingernails were broken and dirty, as if she had been climbing or running through the woods for a long time. She wore no jewelry, and her simple dress was of decent, sturdy cloth, though now torn and stained. She was a puzzle, and Leo had never liked puzzles. They demanded attention, and attention led to involvement. Dawn was a gray smear in the sky when he heard the rustle from the other room. He was on his feet instantly, knife in hand, standing in the doorway. She was awake, propped up on one elbow. Her eyes, a clear, intelligent gray in the weak light, locked onto his. They held no fear of him, only a quick, assessing sharpness that took in the room, his weapon, his posture. This was not the look of a helpless victim. It was the look of someone calculating her next move. "The wound is clean," Leo said, his voice rough. He didn't move from the doorway. "You lost blood, but the fever didn't come." She nodded slowly, wincing with the movement. "Thank you." Her voice was still weak, but clearer now, low and measured. She looked down at the neat stitching. "You have a steady hand." "A necessary skill," he replied, not elaborating. A long silence stretched between them, filled only by the crackle of the fire. "I am Mara," she finally offered, her gaze not leaving his. "Leo." "Leo," she repeated, as if testing the weight of it. "I am sorry to bring this trouble to your door." "You did," he stated flatly. "You said, they are coming." "Who?" A shadow passed over her face. She pushed herself up further, gritting her teeth against the pain. "Men. 2 of them. They have been tracking me for 3 days." She looked toward the window, as if expecting to see shapes forming in the misty morning. "They want something I carry." Leo's eyes instinctively dropped to her hands, which were empty, then to her person. She had no bag, no obvious pouch. "It is not a thing you can hold," she said, reading his glance. "It is knowledge. A location." She hesitated, and for the first time, he saw genuine fear flicker in her gray eyes. The location of the king's missing son. The words hung in the air, absurd and terrifying. The kingdom had been shrouded in muted grief for a year. The young prince, barely 10 years old, had vanished during a royal hunt in the northern forests. The official story was a tragic accident, a lost child taken by wolves or drowned in a river. Searches had turned up nothing. The king had aged a decade in a month. It was a sorrow that had even reached Leo's isolated forge, carried by traveling merchants and soldiers. "You expect me to believe," Leo said slowly, "that the prince is alive, that you know where he is, and that men are chasing you to stop you from telling anyone?" "I expect nothing," Mara said, a flash of defiance in her tired voice. "But it is the truth. I was a junior scribe in the service of Lord Rykar, the king's cousin. I found a hidden ledger, a record of payments and coded messages. I deciphered enough to understand. The prince was not lost. He was taken. And he is being held, not in the north, but here, in the Thornwood." She gestured weakly toward the dense, briar-choked forest that bordered the far side of the mountains, a place even hunters avoided. Leo felt a coldness that had nothing to do with the morning chill. If this was true, it was a viper's nest of treason and danger. If it was a lie, it was a dangerous fantasy that had already brought violence to his home. "Why you?" he asked. "Why not go to the guards? To the capital?" "Lord Rykar's men are the guards in our district," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "I thought I could trust the captain. I showed him a piece of the code. That night, the men came for me. The captain was with them. I barely escaped out a window. They have hunted me since. I have been running, hiding, circling back toward the Thornwood because I think the prince is there. I have no proof anyone else will believe. Just my word, and the memory of a ledger that is surely ashes by now." She looked at him, her exhaustion and desperation laid bare. "I saw your smoke yesterday. I was desperate. I saw your gate and I took a chance." "A chance on a man known for turning people away," Leo said, a bitter twist to his words. "A man with a forge, who lives alone and values his privacy," she countered softly. "I thought you might understand the value of a secret. And I had no choice." The logic was terrible and sound. Leo looked at her. This scribe turned fugitive with a king's ransom of dangerous knowledge in her head. He had pulled her from the storm, mended her body, and now he held a piece of a story that could get them both killed. "They will track you here," Leo said, the reality settling like a stone in his gut. "The blood on my gate. The trail in the mud." "They will," Mara agreed, her face grim. "By midday, perhaps sooner." The safe, predictable walls of his life were not just cracked, they were crumbling. He could still walk away. He could give her some food, point her toward the Thornwood, and shut his gate. He could pretend none of this ever happened. But he looked at her, sitting wounded and defiant on the cot, holding a truth that could alter a kingdom. He thought of a lost boy, a prince, alone in the terrible Thornwood. And he thought of his own long, self-imposed exile, built on a different kind of loss. Turning her away now would not bring back his peace. It would only make him part of the silence that let terrible things happen. A heavy resolve settled over him. It felt foreign, like putting on an old, stiff coat. "You cannot travel yet," he said, his decision made. "The stitch will tear." But they will come, she started. Let them come, Leo interrupted, his voice low and hard. He hefted the hammer in his hand, his blacksmith's tool now a potential weapon. This is my place. And I have turned away my last visitor. The morning light grew stronger, turning the mist outside into a shimmering veil. It did not feel like a reveal, but a prelude. Leo moved with a quiet urgency. His solitude had bred a deep familiarity with his own defenses. They were few, but he would use them all. He barred the shutters on the inside with thick iron rods normally used to brace wagon wheels. He moved an old heavy anvil to block the back door, a task that made his muscles burn. He checked the latch on the front gate, knowing it was only a formality. If they were determined, they would climb the stone wall. His eyes kept returning to the tree line, a dark, jagged seam against the brightening sky. Mara appeared in the doorway of the main room, leaning heavily against the frame. Her face was pale but set. She had found a clean, old tunic of his to wear over her bandaged waist, the coarse fabric dwarfing her frame. "You cannot fight them head-on," she said, her voice strained but clear. "They are soldiers. Trained." "I am a blacksmith," Leo replied, not looking at her as he tested the edge of his longest forging chisel with his thumb. "I know how to break things that are hard." He finally met her gaze. "Can you use a weapon?" She shook her head. "A scribe's tools are a quill and a brain." "Then your tool today is your brain," he said, striding past her into the storage room. He returned with a large, rolled-up hide, a worn bearskin. "The root cellar." He pointed to a trapdoor near the hearth, mostly hidden by a rag rug. "It is small, dark, and smells of earth. You will go down there. You will pull this hide over the door after it closes. You will not make a sound, no matter what you hear." Mara's eyes widened. "I will not hide while you." "You will," he cut in, his voice leaving no room for argument. "They are not coming for a fight with me. They are coming for you and the secret in your head. If they find you, I lose any advantage. If they do not, they have to deal with me first." He saw the protest forming on her lips, the shame of being a burden. "This is not bravery. It is tactics. You are the objective. I am the terrain. Now, go." The blunt military analogy seemed to reach her. She gave a short, tight nod. Leo heaved open the trapdoor, revealing a yawning darkness and the smell of cool, damp soil. He helped her down the rough wooden steps, her grip on his arm surprisingly strong. At the bottom, she looked up, her face a pale oval in the gloom. "Leo," she whispered, "do not be a hero. Just be a stubborn rock in their path." A ghost of something that was almost a smile touched his lips. "That, I can do." He lowered the door, heard the scrape of the bearskin being dragged over it, and then replaced the rug. To any eye but his own, the entrance was invisible. The house now felt emptier, the silence a loaded thing. He was alone again, but the solitude was different. It was an active, waiting silence. He did not have to wait long. Just as the sun cleared the treetops, burning off the last of the mist, he heard it. Not the crash of approach, but the deliberate, quiet sounds of professionals. The soft clink of a scabbard against a buckle, the crunch of a carefully placed boot on gravel. They were here. Leo positioned himself at his forge, his back to the cold furnace. He picked up a half-finished horsehoe and began to file it, the steady shush-shush of metal on metal, a defiantly normal sound in the tense air. A shadow fell across the window. Then a heavy fist pounded on the front door, not on the outer gate. They were already in his yard. "Open in the name of the king's peace," a voice called, authoritative and cold. Leo laid down his file. He walked to the door, took a breath that felt like his first in hours, and opened it. Two men stood there. They wore the polished leather and deep green cloaks of the king's forest guard, but something about them was off. Their uniforms were travel-stained, yes, but it was their eyes, flat, calculating, and devoid of the weary patience of true guardsmen. The taller one, with a thin scar bisecting his eyebrow, stood slightly forward. The other, broader and quieter, had his hand resting casually on the hilt of his sword. Leo's gaze swept past them to his yard. The gate was unbroken, but the lock hung open, picked with skill. "Can I help you?" Leo asked, his voice the same neutral tone he used with difficult customers. "We are tracking a fugitive," Scar said, his eyes already darting past Leo into the dim interior of the house. "A woman. Dangerous. She stole valuable state documents. We have reason to believe she came this way last night, in the storm." Leo leaned against the doorframe, blocking the view. "A stormy night. I heard nothing but the wind." The second guard's eyes narrowed. He was looking at the ground, at the mud near the doorstep. The storm had washed much away, but not everything. "You had a visitor," he stated, pointing to a faint, scuffed impression that could have been a boot, or simply a trick of the light. "Recently. I am a blacksmith," Leo said, crossing his arms. "People come with broken tools." "At dawn." Scar pressed, taking a step closer. The threat in his movement was subtle but unmistakable. "We saw smoke from your chimney last night. A light. Someone was awake. Someone might have taken in a wounded stranger." Leo held his ground. "I work early. I live alone. I saw no woman." The quiet guard suddenly moved, not toward Leo, but along the front of the house, peering into the shuttered windows. "The shutters are barred from the inside," he called out, his voice laced with suspicion. A curious precaution for a simple man expecting no trouble. The air tightened. Scar's hand drifted to his own sword. "We will search the premises. For your safety, and ours." "You have no warrant from the local magistrate," Leo said, the law a thin shield. "The king's business supersedes local warrants," Scar replied, a nasty smile touching his lips. "Step aside, blacksmith." This was the moment. The line was drawn. Leo knew if he let them in, they would find the cellar. They would find Mara. His years of isolation screamed at him to comply, to let this trouble pass over him. But he thought of her whisper in the storm. "I need help." He thought of a boy, a prince, lost in the thornwood. He had chosen his side. "No," Leo said, the words simple and final. Scar's smile vanished. "You are obstructing the king's justice." "You are trespassing on my property," Leo countered, his voice dropping to a low growl. "You picked my lock. You have no proof of your claim. You will leave." For a long, silent second, they stared at him, surprised by the resistance from this solitary, rough-looking man. Then the quiet guard nodded, almost imperceptibly. Scar moved. His sword cleared its scabbard in a smooth, practiced motion. "Then we will do what we must." Leo did not reach for a weapon. He took a single step back, into the shadow of the doorway, and kicked a hidden iron rod laid across the floor. There was a sharp twang from above the door, and a bucket, positioned precariously on the high lintel, tipped over. It did not contain water. It contained a thick, black slurry of soot, ash, and forged slag collected from a week's work. The foul, gritty deluge showered down directly onto Scar's head and shoulders. He roared in shock and disgust, stumbling back, his sword arm coming up to shield his eyes which were now filled with stinging grime. He was blinded, choking, his fine green cloak instantly ruined. It was the moment of distraction Leo needed. He lunged not for the blinded man, but for the quiet one, who was staring in stunned disbelief at his partner. Leo's hammer, left on a bench by the door, was in his hand. He didn't swing for the man's head, but for the wrist of his sword hand. The crack of iron on bone was sickening. The guard screamed, his sword clattering to the stone floor. Chaos erupted. The blinded Scar swung his sword wildly, snarling curses. The other guard clutched his broken wrist, face white with pain. Leo stood between them and the heart of the house, hammer ready, breath coming hard. He had drawn first blood, but the fight was far from over. They were wounded, angry, and now they knew he was not just an obstacle, but an active enemy. From the corner of his eye, Leo saw a flicker of movement at the side window. A third shadow. They hadn't come with just two. The world narrowed to the space inside Leo's workshop. The stink of soot and blood filled the air. Scar, still half-blinded, wiped frantically at his eyes with his cloak, his sword held out in a shaky defensive stance. The second guard, his wrist bent at a wrong angle, had retrieved his sword with his left hand, his movements awkward but his eyes burning with hate. And then the third man entered through the still-open front door. He was different. Older, with a weathered face and cool, detached eyes that swept over the scene. His disheveled comrades, the soot-splattered floor, Leo standing defiant with his hammer, without a flicker of surprise. He wore no uniform, just practical, dark travel clothes. This, Leo knew with a sinking certainty, was the real hunter. The others were just hounds. Enough, the older man said. His voice was quiet, but it cut through the snarling tension. Scar and the wounded guard stilled, their anger banked by clear authority. The man looked at Leo. You are more trouble than you're worth, blacksmith. Give us the woman. You can go back to your anvil and your silence. This doesn't have to end with you dead on your own floor. Leo adjusted his grip on the hammer. His heart hammered against his ribs, but his voice was steady. You're not king's men. Who do you really serve? A faint, approving smile touched the older man's lips. Perceptive. It doesn't matter. The woman carries a truth that cannot be allowed to reach the capital. That is all you need to know. Now, for the last time. Where is she? He took a step forward. The other two, emboldened, flanked him. Leo was cornered, the cold forge at his back. He could swing his hammer, maybe take one more down, but not all three. Not with this calm, dangerous man leading them. He thought of the cellar, of Mara hiding in the dark. He had promised to be a stubborn rock. Rocks eventually get worn down. Just as the older man was about to signal the attack, a sound broke the standoff. It was a low, metallic scrape, followed by a solid thud from the direction of the storage room. The sound of the heavy anvil being moved from the back door. All four men turned. The back door swung inward. Mara stood there, framed in the morning light. She was pale as parchment, leaning heavily against the doorframe, one hand pressed to her bandaged side. But in her other hand, held with both a trembling and terrible resolve, was Leo's old hunting crossbow. It was loaded, the iron bolt pointed at the older man's chest. You want the knowledge, she said, her voice thin but razor-sharp. It dies with me. And I will take one of you with me. I suggest it be him. She nodded toward the leader. A new silence, even more deadly, descended. The crossbow was a weapon of distance and fear. In the close quarters, one shot was all she would get. The older man's cool detachment finally cracked, replaced by icy calculation. You won't, he said. You need to live to tell your tale. Do I? Mara's finger tightened on the trigger. The boy is in the old watchtower in the heart of the Thornwood. The one they call the Widow's Tooth. The ledger said it was under the stone where the eagle fell. That is all I know. It is in your head now, and his, and his. She gestured with the crossbow's point to the two guards. So kill me. See which of you races to the Thornwood first to claim the prize from your master. Or which one runs to the king to trade the secret for a pardon. The genius of her move struck Leo like a physical blow. She hadn't just revealed the secret. She had weaponized it, turning their greed and distrust against them. The information was no longer contained. It was a seed of betrayal planted among them. The older man's face darkened. He saw the same calculation in his men's eyes, a flicker of avarice, of self-preservation. Their unified purpose shattered in an instant. You foolish girl, he hissed. Now, Leo, Mara whispered, her strength clearly fading. It was all the cue he needed. While their attention was fractured, he moved. He didn't charge. He threw his hammer. It was a clumsy, heavy missile, but it flew straight at the second guard, the one with the broken wrist. The man yelped and ducked, breaking formation. Chaos erupted again, but this time it was different. The older man lunged for Mara, not to capture, but to strike. She pulled the trigger. The bolt took him high in the shoulder, spinning him around with a grunt of pain. He crashed into a workbench, scattering tools. Scar, his vision clearing, looked from his wounded leader to the door, to Leo who was now advancing with a heavy iron prybar in hand. The greed and fear in Mara's words did their work. "The Thornwood," he muttered. Without a backward glance, he turned and fled out the front door, into the morning. The guard with the broken wrist saw his ally flee and his leader wounded. Panic seized him. He dropped his sword and followed Scar, disappearing into the yard. Only the older man remained, clutching his bleeding shoulder, his face a mask of fury and defeat. He looked at Mara, who was now sinking slowly down the doorframe, the spent crossbow clattering to the floor. He looked at Leo, who stood over him, prybar raised. "It's over," Leo said, his breath ragged. The man spat blood onto the sooty floor. "You think this ends with me? He will send others. Better ones." "Let him," Leo said. He brought the prybar down, not on the man's head, but on the bench beside him with a deafening crash. "The secret is out. The race is on. And you are no longer in it." He bound the man's hands with a length of sturdy wire from his forge, ignoring his threats and curses. He was still muttering about a powerful he, when Leo secured him to the heavy anvil post. Then he rushed to Mara. She had slid to the floor, her eyes closed, but she was breathing. The effort, the final stand, had drained her last reserves. Gently, he lifted her and carried her back to the cot. It took 3 days. 3 days of tense vigilance, of tending to Mara's reopened wound and the sullen, silent prisoner in the workshop. On the morning of the 4th day, a contingent of real King's Guards, these ones with the weary, honest faces of soldiers on a hard duty, arrived at the gate. They had been alerted by a traveling tinker who had seen 2 men in torn green cloaks fleeing wildly through the woods. Leo told his story. Mara, stronger now, told hers. The captured older man, faced with the king's own captain, remained silent, but his presence was confession enough. The captain, a grave man with kind eyes, listened intently. When Mara repeated the clue, asterisk the old watchtower, under the stone where the eagle fell asterisk, he nodded slowly. "The widow's tooth. We know it. A cursed place. We would never have thought to look there." He looked at them both, his gaze resting on Leo. "You have done the kingdom a greater service than you can know." They took the prisoner away. The captain left 2 guards at the forge for protection, with promises that a royal party would be dispatched to the Thornwood immediately. In the sudden, returned quiet, Leo and Mara found themselves alone again, but the silence was no longer empty. It was filled with the echoes of what had happened and the unspoken weight of what came next. The afternoon sun streamed through the open door, cleaning away the shadows of the fight. Mara sat by the hearth, mending her torn dress with careful stitches. Leo worked at his forge, the rhythmic ringing of his hammer a familiar, comforting song. He stopped after a while, looking at her. She looked up and met his gaze. "They will find him, won't they?" Leo asked. "I believe they will," Mara said softly. "The truth is a persistent thing. Once freed, it's hard to bury again." He nodded, looking around his shop, at his walls that had failed to keep the world out. He felt no anger at their failure, only a strange, tentative sense of something new. "And you?" he asked. "When you are healed, will you go to the capital? Tell your story to the king?" Mara considered, her needle still. "My story is told. The scribe's work is done." She looked at him, a question in her gray eyes. "I find I have no desire to return to a court of whispers and ledgers. I was thinking, a quiet place to recover. A place that needs a steady hand for writing, perhaps, and a mind for keeping things in order." A slow understanding dawned on Leo. The solitude he had cherished had been a prison of his own making. The woman who had arrived bleeding had not just brought trouble, she had brought a key. He gestured vaguely around the room, at the dusty ledgers for his trade, at the untidy shelves. It's not much. And it's quiet. A true smile, the first he had seen, touched Mara's lips. It changed her whole face, lighting it from within. Quiet, she said. Sounds perfect. Leo turned back to his anvil, the heat of the forge warming his skin. He picked up his hammer. The next blow he struck was not to build a wall or forge a barrier. It was to make something new, something useful, for a world that had, at last, found its way back in. The end. Final hook. The immediate threat is over, but the consequences ripple outward. The prince's fate hangs on the clue Mara revealed. Leo and Mara have forged an unlikely partnership in the aftermath, choosing a shared future in the quiet forge. But the mysterious he, who sent the hunters, is still out there. Has their victory truly secured their peace, or merely postponed a greater storm?